This recorded lecture will cover the Neolithic period. Here we see a map, and indicated on it are 4 different river valley civilizations. Now, 2 of these we're definitely going to cover in the class since it's a Western focused course. And so during this humanities course, we're definitely going to be talking about the Nile River Valley and the Egyptian culture that's going to develop along it. We'll also be talking about the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley and what we call the Mesopotamian culture that develops there. But I just want you to be aware that there are in fact several other places where Neolithic culture is going to develop. And these other ones, which we don't get the chance to cover in this course, are the Indus-Ganges River Valley in India, and then of course the Yellow River in ancient China. Now, well, what is the Neolithic period? Well, it's the New Stone Age, and it's going to appear at different times at different locations. And this is due to the ice age. The sheets of ice are melting, and this is a very uneven process. And so, for example, the Neolithic Near East, we see that starts around 8,000. But then if you look at, well, when does the Neolithic start in Europe? That's a little bit further north, so it takes a little bit extra time. That begins around 6,500. Now, the ice melting is not the only thing that's going to be an indicator of when the Neolithic starts. It's what happens once the ice melts that is going to define this period. And there are 3 characteristics of the Neolithic period. First, we have the domestication of animals, or what we call animal husbandry. So cattle and dogs are going to be domesticated. So the dog has in fact been our best friend for a rather long time. Then we have the introduction of agriculture. Food production is going to replace the hunter-gathering, which was the way to get food before. And so there's going to be an organized system of agriculture, and this is going to develop during the Neolithic period. Now this, the domestication of animals, the introduction of agriculture, this is going to lead to the third thing, the creation of permanent architecture. You're going to have year-round settlements, then sort of moving around and gathering up your stuff and following the herd. So by about 9,000 BCE, the earliest settled communities appear, and these are going to appear in what we call the Fertile Crescent, or ancient Mesopotamia. And so that's the land between the 2 rivers you saw on the map, the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. From the Fertile Crescent, farming will spread to the Atlantic coast of Europe by about 5,000 or so BCE. Now, the first image we want to look at that fits into the Neolithic are these human figures from Ain Ghazal in modern-day Jordan. The houses here may have resembled adobe structures of native peoples in the southwestern United States. Among the objects recovered from Ain Ghazal are more than 30 of these plaster figures. So I'm showing you a couple examples here, but there were obviously a lot more. They're created through a process where wet plaster is applied to a core of reeds and twine. Now this is called additive sculpture because we're building up the sculpture from various materials. The sculptures that we saw in the previous lecture, so the Venus of Willendorf, the human figure with feline head, both of those were subtractive sculpture. And subtractive, you have a piece of stone and you carve it away. And so that's the subtractive method. These are additive because they're building it up. They're using the reeds, the twine, the plaster. They're inlaying cowrie shells for the eyes. And the pupils are represented using a tar-like substance called bitumen. Now, the examples seen here, note that one of them is almost 3.5 feet tall. Now, what does this tell us about the Neolithic? Well, it tells us that if you now reside in a culture where you have a permanent settlement and you don't have to move from place to place, then maybe you're more interested in making larger pieces of art. And so, you wouldn't want to carry around something that's 3.5 foot tall if you lived during the days of hunter-gathering. But now that it's the Neolithic, that's absolutely fine. Now, this, I'm sure you all know what it is, of course, and may have heard a number of different things about it, and so we're going to work through some of them. It's obviously Stonehenge. Huge stones were being used to construct ceremonial structures and tombs. We call these monuments megalithic architecture. They're found in parts of France, Spain, and Northern Europe. And so Stonehenge is just one example of megalithic architecture. Now, if you have a single shaped stone standing upright, we call that a menhir. Now, there are more than 3,000 standing stones erected at different locations. One particular location, the French village of Carnac, has a ton of standing stones. Now, arranging the stones in a circle, which is called a cromlech or a hinge, is almost entirely limited to Britain. Cromlechs first appear around 3000 or so BCE. And so Stonehenge, we want to talk about what construction method are they using for this. They're using what we call the post and lintel construction method. And we have a little diagram here beneath to see how it works. The two uprights are the posts. The piece that is laid across the top of them to form a sort of doorway is called the lintel. And this method is one of the simplest construction methods to create an architectural space. The other image is showing you something really, really important that maybe not everyone realizes. That they didn't just gather the stones and sort of arrange them. They also took the time to manipulate the surface of the stone. And so you see here that there's a little sort of prong on the top. It should remind you of like a Lego, right? And so this is meant to be inserted into a hole, which was then cut into the lintel. So in many ways, it is like a Lego system that we have being created here. Now, many theories are going to exist on how Stonehenge is used, how it was built, what does it mean. We're going to talk about several of them, and then we're going to discuss the relationship between Stonehenge and what is known as Woodhenge. So here, the photograph, we are inside of Stonehenge, inside the central circles, and we're looking out towards what's called the heel stone. Now, one theory, general theory, about megalithic monuments, Stonehenge included, is that they're built as territorial markers and sort of ritual centers at a time when population pressure upon the land increased as a result of the agricultural revolution. And so this is creating a need for peoples to express their territory. Now, Stonehenge, it rises from the Salisbury Plain in southern England. It was built in several stages over more than 1,000 years. The edifice now standing at the site represents the third and final phase of its construction. It is surrounded by a great ditch that was probably dug using antler picks. There are 56 pits situated just inside the ditch in a circle. These pits have been excavated. They have revealed cremation burials in most of them. And so we know that there were some people that were buried at or nearby Stonehenge. The outer circle, as you can see here, is a continuous post and lintel construction of rough-cut sarsen. It's a type of sandstone. The lintels, of course, as you saw in the previous slide, have holes carved into them to insert the stone peg up into of the post. The upright stones are thought to have been deliberately shaped so that their sides would appear to be straight from a distance. This is a diagram of Stonehenge then and now. And so we see some colors differentiating different types of stones here. So we have what are known as the blue stones. These are volcanic rock imported over 250 miles from Wales. And we see they're indicated blue, of course, in the diagram. Then inside the two outer circles, we have some horseshoe-shaped arrangements of stones. So there are 5 post and lintels in there, and a smaller U-shape of the blue stones. Now, some of these stones that form the larger of the two horseshoe shapes weigh as much as 50 tons and were still brought a considerable distance. They were brought from about 20 to 30 miles away from a place known as Marlborough Downs. Now, it should be pointed out that the function of Stonehenge, not unlike many other objects we'll discuss throughout the course, has changed many times to reflect the interest of the times. It's previously been posited as a Druid temple a landing site for flying saucers. And if you go way back into the Middle Ages, there's a fanciful 12th century account that tells how the wizard Merlin moved Stonehenge from Ireland to Salisbury Plain. And so they didn't know how it got there in the Middle Ages, and their explanation was magic. It was the wizard Merlin from, the King Arthur legends. Now, in the 60s, a book titled Stonehenge Decoded began an interest in positing the Neolithic monument as a solar and lunar observatory. How many astronomical alignments exist is still hotly debated. Most scholars agree that the heel stone is aligned. So if I switch to this view here, it's one that we can see further out, surrounding Stonehenge, and you can in fact see where the heel stone is in relation to the stone circles. The heel stone to the east is noticeably off-center. It's to the right of the site's main axis. Now, it was once thought that an observer standing in the middle of the circle would have seen the sun rise over the heel stone on June 21st, what we call the summer solstice. Recent scholarship has shown that the sun would actually have been 2.5 degrees to the left back then, because a lot of things have changed. The Earth and its relationships with other planets and the sun. These things are not permanent. The forward tilt of the heel stone over time has only made it appear to align. Well, they solved this discrepancy. There were people that said, okay, I agree with that statement, and we'll take another look. And in 1982, they found the imprint of a second stone to the left of the current heel stone. So to make this more accurate, let's go ahead and see if we can't do this and draw in our second heel stone here. So there would be another heel stone like over here. And so the new interpretation is that the sun would have risen on alignments between the two heel stones. And so just, we'll put a little sun here. It's not going to be very good. It's hard to draw with this thing. But here's our sun over top, rising over top the two heel stones, right? And so that would be the alignment on the summer solstice. Now, they went further and investigated more, and they realized that other stones may align with the moon. So the 56 pits that I mentioned earlier, they can be linked to the 28-day cycle of the moon. If you were to take a marker and move it 2 holes every day, you would be able to keep track of the cycle of the moon. So it seems like there are solar alignments and now lunar alignments as well. Now, why would you want anything to align with, say, the sun or the moon? Well, the timing of seasonal changes was of the utmost importance to early agricultural societies. And we have, in fact, earlier cromlechs, which also seem to be aligned to sunrise at the winter or summer solstice. So it's not like Stonehenge is the only one. Other recent work on Stonehenge has emphasized that the site lies in a field of funeral barrows and has searched for an association between these tombs and the monuments. Another massive henge, it's up at Durrington Walls, and you see it indicated here. So up here we have what is known as Woodhenge, and of course Stonehenge is down here. And so they're not all that far apart. There's evidence at Woodhenge where there were post holes for circular timber structures, and this is about 2 miles or so northeast of Stonehenge. There's also evidence of small houses here, and both Stonehenge and the Woodhenge area seem to possess sort of avenues connecting them to the river Avon, which, by the way, that word means river, so it technically means river, which I always find sort of hilarious. And so here we go with Woodhenge. It no longer exists because obviously if it's made of wood, it's not a dry enough climate or a cold enough climate to survive, and so the wood deteriorated. So our knowledge is based on the post holes, as I mentioned. And so here we have a reconstruction then of what it might have looked like. So it's artist's sort of interpretation. And so the new theory is that the Woodhenge area was the domain of the living, and the Stonehenge area represents the domain of the ancestral dead. And this is not a crazy idea. There are a number of other cultures where they're going to differentiate between a sort of this is where people live and this is where people go when they die. Ancient Egypt's going to be a really obvious one, and we'll talk about that divide when we take a look at the Egyptian humanities. Now, the Neolithic period is going to end with the introduction of bronze working. And this happens around 3400 or so BCE for the Near East, a little bit later for Europe, about 2300 BCE. And we call the new period Bronze Age. So we go from Stone Age to Bronze Age. Now, why bronze? Well, copper was abundant in Central Europe, but too soft to be very useful. Ergo, it was mixed with tin to create the alloy bronze. Bronze is stronger, it's harder than copper. And so what you're looking at here is a really, really cool item, and we're going to see that it in fact can be tied to Stonehenge. It appeared in 2001. It's called the Nebra Sky Disk. Initially, people thought it was a forgery, but it's now widely considered authentic. It was looted by treasure hunters, and the archaeologists have examined the site where the treasure hunters said they found it, and taken samples of the earth at the site and compared it to samples of the earth and the dirt sticking to the actual disc, and they match. The disc was found with several bronze swords at Mittelberg Hill in Germany, and we date it to about 1600 BCE or so. The Nebra sky disk is covered with gold symbols, generally interpreted as a sun, lunar crescent, and stars. The 32 stars include the 7 dots clustered together, and these most likely represent the Pleiades. Here we have a diagram next to it, so you can see what I'm talking about. They label where the Pleiades are shown on the Nebra sky disk. The Pleiades were quite visible in winter in the northern hemisphere. The 2 arcs were added at a later date and span an angle of 82 degrees. Now you might say, well, that's great and all, but what does that mean, right? 82 degrees. Well, this correctly indicates the angle between sunset at summer and winter solstice at the Mittelberg, Germany latitude. The gold used is of a different origin as well, and so the gold is coming from somewhere else. The final addition was the sunboat arc at the bottom of the disc. Now, by the time the disc was buried, it had about 40 holes punched out around its perimeter. We're not exactly sure what those holes are, what they're tracking with these punctures. But what we can gather from the 82 degrees and what that means is that the disc is the oldest known portable instrument to mark solstices. So let's think about it this way. If Stonehenge is like a large clock, like say Big Ben in London, then the Nebra sky disk, this little bronze disc, is like a watch that you can carry it with you and transport it, and it correctly identifies when things are going to happen, when the summer and winter solstice are going to happen at that particular location where these people were seemingly living right there in Germany.